Hey guys, Dr. Justin Marcagiani here. We're going to be doing a video today all about blood sugar fluctuations and how they impact female hormones, cortisol, prolactin, the whole 9 yards. We're going to dive in. We're going to talk about hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia, high and low blood sugar. We're going to talk about progesterone and cortisol connection. We're going to interweave some prolactin and dopamine info here as well and try to put it all together. And we're going to talk about that blood sugar roller coaster and why we want to stay away from it and why I think blood sugar can be one of the biggest stressors on the hormonal system, and most people are ignoring it. So before we dive in, please smash that like button. Really helps the search algorithm. Give me a thumbs up. Put your comments down below. Love to know your thoughts on the topic. All right, so first off, we have these blood sugar fluctuations from hypo, which is low, to hyper is high. Think of hyperactive, hypothermia is low, hyperactive high, right? We have this blood sugar fluctuation roller coaster. Now, depending on the type of meal we eat, the more our blood sugar fluctuates due to too much carbs, not enough protein or fat, right? And so typically you need to have some level of processed carbohydrate or just higher carbohydrate without protein and fat that can create blood sugar swings. It could be a bunch of fruit without any protein or fat. Think of a vegan vegetarian meal. It could be just a lot of processed carbs and some protein and fat. So just an imbalanced meal with more protein, less protein and fat, and more carbohydrate, especially more processed carbohydrate. That's going to keep this blood sugar roller coaster going. Now, when the blood sugar goes up, we have this push of insulin that gets secreted by the beta cells of the pancreas to bring down that blood sugar. When the blood sugar crashes, we make a whole bunch of cortisol and adrenaline to pick it back up. That's why these blood sugar fluctuations can create moodiness, irritability, dizziness, even vertigo things, lightheadedness. You can even have blood pressure issues, especially if your adrenals are weaker. You may have lower aldosterone, and it may be harder for you to hold on to your minerals because aldosterone plays a really important role with impacting sodium, potassium, etc. And so we can have a big imbalances when we see these blood sugar roller coasters happen. So one, we're going to secrete a whole bunch of cortisol. When cortisol is made at higher levels, cortisol can rob progesterone. Progesterone can be pulled downstream to make cortisol. So the more stressed, the more inflamed we are, the more we can impact progesterone. Now, when we start to lower progesterone, that can create estrogen dominance. So if we look at like a typical female cycle, the first half of the cycle is going to be your follicular phase where estrogen predominates. And then we have like around day 10, progesterone starts to increase and spikes around day 15. So that kind of 12 to 15 time frame is where typical ovulation is. And then from 15 to 27 is typically the luteal phase. And so if we start to lower progesterone in that luteal phase when it comes up because we're making a lot of cortisol, that can impact and cause more PMS symptoms. Think moodiness, irritability. Hey, similar blood sugar symptoms, right? Moodiness, irritability. It can create breast tenderness, cramping, back pain, sleep issues, right? The whole 9 yards because you're lowering that progesterone. Progesterone opens the GABA chloride channel. So anytime you have mood issues, you're not relaxed, you're irritable, progesterone can impact it. Also, if progesterone starts to peter out earlier in the cycle, it can cause heavy menstrual flow. And you don't have that punctuated drop in progesterone that should be there like around day 26, 27, 28. Now it's coming earlier and it's petering out, which can create the consistent kind of bleeding that just happens, or you're just spotting for a longer period of time and you have a lot of heavy just menstrual flow, and that in itself can actually drive anemia. So anemia being lower iron, when you start to have low iron, now you don't carry oxygen adequately, and when you don't have low oxygen, you're not going to have good mitochondrial function because you need oxygen to get into the electron transport chain, to get into the Krebs cycle, to generate ATP. So we need good oxygen. We need the good nutrients to do that. Now, also, when we start to have these cortisol fluctuations, cortisol can also cause imbalances with insulin because high cortisol means we're mobilizing glucose. Why is that? Because cortisol is a stress hormone. And so if we're in stress, our body is usually hardwired to think, ooh, stress, we need energy to fight, flight, or flee. And if we don't have that energy, we may not be able to fight, flight, or flee. The problem is most stress doesn't require you to fight a tiger or to run from something. So now you've mobilized all this glucose. What do you do with it? Well, now you need to actually get insulin in there to bring that glucose back into the cell, store it as fat, store it in your muscles, glycogen, fat second, and then burn it up. But if you're not active, you're not going to burn it up. And so this is the problem. This is why this blood sugar, cortisol, progesterone, right? And then also insulin impacts our blood sugar as well, because cortisol then causes that blood sugar to go up. And now insulin is actually higher now not because you ate a whole bunch of carbs like I created in the first scenario, but because you're stressed and that cortisol is now mobilizing lots of glucose, and that glucose is what your insulin is now responding to from your stress hormones, not just your diet. Now, if you have a bad diet and you're also stressed, now it's a double whammy. So now you could be eating, let's say, processed foods, lots of carbohydrate things, maybe inflammatory foods that, let's say may have the same amount of carbs, let's say wheat bread versus white potato, maybe same carbs, but because the wheat may be more inflammatory because you're gluten sensitive, you could actually have more cortisol, more blood sugar issues just because of the inflammatory nature. And you can test this with a blood sugar device like the KetoMojo. I did a video on how to look at functional glucose tolerance. This is the best way to see how your blood sugar is responding to food. And you may find similar carbohydrates actually cause more blood sugar imbalances because of the cortisol and because of the inflammatory nature of the food, not just the carbohydrates. So KetoMojo is great because you get a device here that will graph everything, hook it up onto your phone so you can see it graphed out. You can plug it into Heads Up Health as well. We'll put a link down below where you guys can get that all linked up, and you can get your Fitbit all linked up for that as well. So you can monitor your steps, you can monitor all your blood sugar. And then you want to do a fasting 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour. And that looks like waking up, for instance, you get your fasting glucose, you eat, an hour later, grab it again, an hour later, grab it again, an hour later, grab it again. Do 2 to 3 random meals throughout the week. Do a breakfast, do a lunch, do a dinner. That way you can see that a couple times throughout the day. And you want to be below 100 at fasting, 120 to 140 or lower 1 hour, below 120 to 100 at hour 2, and below 100 in hour 3. That gives you a pretty good indication. The longer your blood sugar is up and the higher it's up, the more insulin resistance there is. Saw someone on Twitter saying today, hey, low carbohydrate diets aren't that beneficial. Carbs aren't going to hurt you. And it's like, well, if you're insulin resistant, carbs are definitely a problem, because the more insulin resistant you are, that means you have a hard time getting glucose into the cells to burn it. And so, yes, if you're insulin resistant, carbs are going to be problematic. And I love having ways like a good blood sugar meter that will allow you to graph it out so you can actually see it and make sense of it. So now we have this cortisol response caused by inflammatory foods, can also mobilize glucose. That glucose now can mobilize insulin, so that's a problem. Now, if you have this reactive hypoglycemia issue, where now you're eating maybe more processed food, your blood sugar goes up, it crashes down. Most people now live their day in this hypo-reactive glycemic type of situation because now their blood sugar's up, it crashes, they get jittery, shaky, and then what do they have cravings for? More carbs, more processed food. So they keep this cycle going. Now, the more cortisol and the more stressed you are going to deplete your dopamine. Why is that important? Because dopamine is an important neurotransmitter that allows for focus, for energy, for cognition. So if you don't have that adequate dopamine, it may be harder to focus, harder to pay attention, harder to have that good feeling, that good mood, that good connection with people because now your dopamine's low. Dopamine is a tonic inhibitor for prolactin. So if your dopamine starts dropping because you're chronically stressed, why does dopamine drop? Because it actually converts downstream to adrenaline. So the more stressed you are, you take that dopamine and you convert it downstream to adrenaline. Now your dopamine starts to drop. Your focus, your mood, your energy, your zest for life starts to drop. That's a tonic inhibitor for prolactin. So now the brake of prolactin starts coming up because you're lowering your dopamine. Dopamine is on essentially the brake pedal. Dopamine drops, brake on prolactin comes off. Now prolactin starts to go up, and prolactin can start to throw off the female cycle. Prolactin is normally made for lactation. So when a woman's pregnant, given a baby, they've given birth, they have this baby, now they're breastfeeding, you get this whole prolactin kind of letdown reflex with oxytocin. That's important for breastfeeding. But now you have women starting to make more prolactin, and they're not pregnant and they're not breastfeeding. So that's a problem because now we have this hormone that comes in there, and prolactin is good because it prevents a woman from starting to cycle again. That's an important thing because you don't want to be pregnant, let's say a month or two into having a baby. That's just not going to work. So it prevents pregnancy. And then it also helps with the whole milk letdown reflex. Well, if it prevents pregnancy, what's it going to do to your cycle now? So now it can start to throw off a female cycle. Now you can have cycle irregularity, skipping cycle, longer cycles. You can have excess PMS symptoms, mood issues, energy issues, back pain, breast tenderness, cramping, the whole 9 yards. We want to really look at things holistically and say, okay, we have blood sugar. We have to make sure we stabilize it. We have to adjust our macros, our protein, fats, and carbs, not do too much so we create this hyper to hypoglycemic roller coaster. We don't want to eat inflammatory food that causes cortisol and inflammatory issues because cortisol itself can create belly fat and can create mood issues. Cortisol can also mobilize glucose. Glucose can also cause more insulin. More insulin can also create issues with dopamine, because now dopamine gets depleted because now you're stressed and inflamed. It goes down to adrenaline. Lower dopamine. Now you're taking the foot off the brake of prolactin. Prolactin starts to go up, which again shuts down a woman's cycle for good reason, because you normally would be breastfeeding. And it also is going to, it's good for a woman that's breastfeeding because you have that milk letdown reflex, but it's going to throw off your cycle and cause dysregulation. Now, I didn't even go into PCOS. So there's an enzyme called 1720 lyase with high levels of insulin. You can upregulate that enzyme, which drives polycystic ovarian syndrome, and that's going to also increase your androgens. Androgens are going to be problematic because as a woman, it's going to cause hair growth, it's going to cause acne, it's going to cause lots of other symptoms that are going to be unwarranted and not good. And PCOS is probably one of the top 3 causes of infertility for women today. And so if your woman wants to be fertile, you do not want ovarian cyst. Insulin is going to be the number 1 driver of that. That's going to drive your androgens, your testosterone up. It's probably the number 1 treatment for PCOS is typically metformin or glucophage, because they're trying to make your body more sensitive to insulin, lower that down. They'll also do like spironolactone, which is like a blood pressure medication used as an anti-androgen. They'll do that to control some of the acne. And so, or they'll even go to like vitamin A analogs. But again, you got to look at it holistically and say, hey, let's get to the root cause in this whole thing. You really want to understand that whole connection. Get your carbohydrates, get your macros, get super nutrient dense, anti-inflammatory, low toxin type of eating plan. And you want to work with a good functional medicine practitioner that can look at everything holistically, really get to the root cause of why these hormonal imbalances are there, testing it, whether it's looking at cortisol, looking at a functional glucose tolerance, looking at fasting insulin. We can even look at just your cortisol rhythm throughout the day, look at progesterone, look at estrogen detoxification. All these are great things to look at. I'll put links down below if you guys want to reach out. There'll be links down there below where you can connect with me, do functional medicine kind of worldwide here. So if you want more support, feel free and connect. And if you enjoyed the content, feel free and share it with friends or family so they can educate and kind of put that power back in their hands. I'll open it up for a couple of questions if you guys have any. Let's see here. So one of the biggest stressors, like I mentioned, is going to be cortisol insulin connection. And that's going to drive the high levels of androgens. And when we start to deplete progesterone, that's going to cause the number 1 hormonal imbalance is this estrogen dominance phenomenon, where this ratio of progesterone to estrogen, normally progesterone is 20 to 25 times higher than estrogen on average. And when that ratio starts to drop, now we start to have more estrogen dominance coming into play. That's going to create skin issues, mood issues, energy issues, weight gain, heavy bleeding, heavy menstrual flow. That can then drive low iron. Low iron can also drive low mitochondrial function because you don't have the oxygen to run into the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle that generates the ATP. So you can see kind of how all these things spiral off. And so just want you guys to be educated so you're aware of it. All right, guys, Dr. J here signing off. Links and coordinates down below if you want to reach out on the functional medicine side. Staff is happy to help you out. All right, guys, have a good one. Take care, y'all. Bye.